He was responsible, I know, for saving the parking mounds in Arkansas, Mound Bottom here, the Sellers site, Red Clay Council grounds in East Tennessee. And I introduced a wonderful man, Mack Prichard.
Thank you, Mark. He's made most of my speech. I wish my mother were here, she would have believed it. Anyway, I'm glad to see you all tonight, and I hope this is not going to feedback too badly, but it's got a little bit. If Jim's here, maybe we could turn it down, but I guess it'll be all right. You're getting double your money with the videographer. And my friend Vic's Scoggin back there, who's back up on the tape machine. Vic's the man that swam the Cumberland River. I guess he knows the territory of the Native American people in Tennessee about as well as anybody. We are very blessed in this wonderful part of the world with the incredible diversity and natural resources of Tennessee, and it attracted from thousands of years ago the first inhabitants of this country who lived well here. There was so much fish, so much game, such rich soil for native peoples to develop a great agricultural basis later on as they enlarged their numbers. And this part of the state here at Mound Bottom particularly, and we'll see that site in a little bit, probably was the Minco, where the chief lived, as the Choctaw would say. And there's a great mace out on the rock bluff overlooking the site, which almost always indicates this is where the boss is. And you find that same symbolism all the way down in Latin America. So I'm going to go ahead with our slides. Some of these slides I shot maybe 40 years ago or more, probably closer to 50. So I hope they fall. And if they don't, we'll worry about it. Let's stick not worry about it. I was surprised a week ago when I was down at Manchester enjoying Mark Norton's program when he got through with his program on the La Brea tar pits and the Pleistocene saber-toothed tigers that we found here in Tennessee and elephants, that he's flashed this thing up. And I had just agreed with Mark to do the program the night before. I'm just not used to how email works and how these modern computers do what they do, but it's pretty amazing. And my grandfather, around 1900, found this point on his farm in West Tennessee. And since I grew up in Memphis, I was fascinated with naturally. I did not inherit this. This is what we would call a Clovis or Cumberland type, and it's the sort of spear point or atlatl point that was used to hunt elephants in the past, and big game. And you're looking at something that's anywhere from 9 to 13,000 years old. We don't know for sure, but some of these peoples were here a long time ago. But anyway, that started me off with a big curious about native peoples. And so when I was a little boy, I guess about 12, I had two other buddies, and we got on our bicycles, and we did a bicycle survey of Nonconnor Creek south of Memphis. And at that time, there were a lot of sites left. The city interstate system had not been built in the 50s, and so we were able to find, I guess, about 20 sites. We found everything from historical Chickasaw, gun flints from the Dover Cliffs of England, to quad points, which go back about like that other paleo type point I showed you, that go back a long ways, maybe 9,000 years or more. We found Poverty Point, baked clay objects, which when the Archaeological Society met, we took our little airheads over there. They want to know where in the world we found these. We said just over here in South Memphis. Well, all these old men were driving 100 miles to go looking for stuff, and here we were on the bicycles. And I found years later that somebody wrote a master's thesis off of all the little sacks of stuff which we labeled that came out of that dig. Now at that time, and let me see if I can find it, I joined the Tennessee Archaeological Society. The Memphis chapter had a group called the Memphis Archaeological and Geological Society, and they they were just wonderful because I could go out with them and go looking for stuff. We would go to Arkansas and look for crystals and geodes and things like that. And I met Chuck Nash, and let me make sure this is going to focus, I believe it is. And Chuck Nash was working at a furniture company at that time, but he was the one who had dug out at Mound Bottom years ago at what was called the Pack site or the Osborne site. And this was back during the 30s when Tom Lewis was state archaeologist at that time. Tom Lewis was, the year I was born, in '39, was our state archaeologist for the Conservation Department. Later he went over, began the Department of Anthropology at UT, but I met him at the archaeological meetings, and he took me under his wing as a young kid needs somebody to take an interest in. He encouraged me, and so did his wife, Madeline. And that made all the difference. And at the Chattanooga meeting, I was elected vice president in 1955 when I was 15, because I was the only other person there from Memphis besides Dr. Pownham, and we had to host the meeting the following year. So that's how kids step into stuff. And so what was great, though, is I met Dr. Matthew Sterling from the Smithsonian Institute at the Chattanooga meeting. And he thought I was sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, so he put me on the free list for all of their publications from the Bureau of American Ethnology. So boy, did that give me a quick start in the archaeology business. Also, I was lucky to find an original copy of Thruston's Antiquities of Tennessee. I met John Brown, author of Old Frontiers, The History of the Cherokee Nation, walking down the street in Memphis. He had retired there. I was also able to get a copy of Walter Malone's Chickasaw Nation. So all these years I've been hooked on books and been lucky to be able to buy some of these when they were available. But for a while I loaned 300 of my books to the archaeology division for their library after I had been there for a while and decided they needed some books, until I noticed that some of the best ones sort of walked off in the middle of the night, and then I had to go back and get what was left. But I guess people go through state offices like that, and you just don't know. When I was a college student, I was hired by the Memphis Museum to make an exhibit on the different diagnostic arrowheads and pot shards, and that was another item my grandfather had found, was this mammoth tooth. I don't know where he got it because I didn't find any letters or records of his stuff, but again, fascinated me. But this is the kind of stuff those points were associated with, those paleo points. And so one thing that struck me, though, about the Memphis Museum, I then got a scholarship to Southwestern, which is now Rhodes College. I was very lucky because of my work with archaeology. The garden clubs recognized me, and I met some of their leaders. And so we got a National Science Grant. And I photographed artifacts in Chicago, artifacts in other museums. But what struck me is a little strange is too many of these precious artifacts that we see here at the McClung Museum were stuffed back in sacks and really weren't visible to the people who really would like to see them, unless you were able to get behind the scenes. Worst of all, there were boxes of human bones that were stacked in some rooms, and plenty of room down front. Y'all just come right in. There's good seats right here on the front row if you don't mind.
Some real goodies.
This projector is the only obstacle. You might need to not sit there, although you're tall enough to see over it. This McClung Museum had 1 million articles that were dug of the Cherokee Nation before TVA flooded the Tellico Dam. And we'll get back to that a little bit later on. But now things have changed. Instead of treating, down at Chattanooga, when they built Interstate 24, Senator Brock tried to get the bulldozer driver to thanks, Michelle, good, to not keep bulldozing the bones of the Indians there at the site on Moxon Bend. And the senator said, "You're just bulldozing those like so much dirt." And the driver said, "Yes, get out of the way, I've got a job to do," and kept on bulldozing the site. So in those days, Native Americans weren't considered human beings. And so now we have the Tennessee Indian Commission, that's Harley Grant, this picture was made several years ago, and other representatives from across the state. And the commission's had its ups and downs because of politics, but that's the way people are. And I'm talking about state politics, not Indian politics. Today, our state archaeologist, Mike Moore, has representatives from the Native American community at the annual meetings of the current research papers. We have representatives of the Indian Commission, and we have laws passed that call for reburial of human remains, and hopefully eventually we'll get more protection. We have also protection of state archaeological sites. Anything state-owned, the archaeologists actually have the authority to enforce the state law, although they haven't, to protect these sites. Now, when I was 15, the Memphis Archaeology Club had a newcomer from Ohio. He had been involved in the preservation of beautiful sites like the Great Serpent Mound and other famous places in Ohio. And he came to Memphis and found out that the Park in Arkansas Mound was about to be bulldozed for dirt to build a new bridge. And so the club went over there one week and talked to the, I believe it was the Kiwanis. The next week, the Rotary found out about it, and they wanted a speaker, but nobody could go that night. So Dad drove me over there in our old 51 Buick, and I made my first talk before these old planters on a hot August night with sweat pouring off of me. There was no air conditioning, and all of these guys chomping on their cigars, and I was scared to death. My knees were wobbly, and I thought I blew it. But finally, afterwards, a guy walked up, and he said, "Well, boy, you're right." Says, "They're not making any more Indian mounds." Says, "I own 1,000 acres. I'll just give them the dirt from somewhere else." And he turned around and gave that site to the city, and the city gave it to the state. So now we have the Park and Archaeological Park. And I just thought, this is what I want to do, is keep after people like that. And by the way, where those folks are standing, in about 1541, Hernando de Soto got this far. And the Indians were trying to decide whether to kill them all or what to do, but they were having a bad time too. They had a terrible drought. And so De Soto, seizing the moment, said, "If you'll let me put a Christian cross up here on the mound, my God will make it rain." And the next day it rained. So he got to go another 100 miles before he ran out of gas in his expedition.
So that was a De Soto before Buick.
This was De Soto, before the Buick, that's right, and that's a different company anyway. So that's the way it goes. It's a wonderful world, but I wanted to talk about some of these different approaches. The mound was a sacred place for the native peoples. It was really a travesty to put that on it, but anyway, you got by with it. Now, here we switch to another place in Memphis called Chucalissa, where the University of Memphis, who was our partner almost from the very beginning of this park site, this was our first Tennessee State Archaeological Park, beginning about 1955, and the queen there of the village was, as you see, a woman, the chief. Many of the tribes here were matriarchal, and that goes deep. They have a completely different orientation. But Nash he was the most imaginative and creative archaeologist, one of the few I've ever known, who had the ability to keep something going all the time. And he was a great dirt archaeologist. He had the ability to put sticks back into the holes where the soft dirt had concealed a post mold, and rebuild the houses. So this house was actually built right where the original stood in exactly the same proportions. Now, we don't know about the roof, but we suspect it was very close. And so he reconstructed a lot of this. We had a penal farm labor crew, and after some of the guys got off of their rap at the institution, we hired them because they were the most experienced diggers we could find. They were worked out wonderfully well. We had, early on, Nash said, "Mack, we need some Indians." And I had just gone to the Choctaw Fair the year before on the Trollways bus. I said, "I know where to get some Indians." So we hired 2 families, and they came up, Choctaw from Philadelphia, and they brought their friends, and we had stickball. Now, I found this picture by Catlin of when, in the old days, stickball was a big deal. The whole tribe would bet everything they had on the outcome of the game, and oftentimes lose it all and have to walk home without anything. This is, I'm not sure where he painted this picture, but Catlin was a remarkable artist from New York City. who felt like if he didn't go out and hurry and paint some of these Indian peoples, that they would be gone forever, and he was dead right. He also felt this way about it. He wrote a letter to the New York Times in 1832 and said there ought to be nations parks where the Native American people could continue to hunt and so far as possible be spared the juggernaut of civilization. That was the first call for national parks. I think Ken Burns may have mentioned that, but anyway, I'll tell you that. And the other thing he said in a nice little comment was what he thought about the native peoples. He said, I love the people who always made me welcome to the best they had, the people who never fought a battle or war except on their own land. And oh, how I love the people that do not live for the love of money. The Native American people are generous and hospitable. And this guy, with that attitude, went all the way across the country when anybody else would have been shot. And he went all the way to South America, all the way up into the Amazon to the Hivero country, the headhunters, and painted their pictures as well. They all regarded him as a holy man, and indeed he was. Well, that's me over on the right with a little darker hair when I was about 18, I guess, and we were digging the plow zone. This is the disturbed area in the top of that mound where the farmers had plowed and had a crop up there. Toward the end of the summer, my supervisors, Mr. Nash, says, you boys better hurry up. We're running out of time. So about the first good shovelful of dirt I took after that, I hit an intrusive burial. I hit a skull of a lady who must have died while the mound was being built, and they just put her in a shallow grave. And so we took a week to clean that out and treat her right. And then the boss again said, all right, now let's get on with it. Well, the next shovelful, I hit a pot which was 4 feet away from the gravesite. When they put her in the ground, they must have thrown a basket load of dirt and knocked the little pot of food that they had left for her to enjoy on the way to Happy Hunting Grounds. And sometimes we would find rice rat bones in those pots where the mice would get in to eat whatever was in there good to eat and then get caught as well. So it was an interesting experience. By the way, let me just say, this guy was full-blood Choctaw, 16 years old. I heard when he got back to Mississippi, he blew his brains out with a shotgun. He was so depressed over how poorly the native peoples were being treated. They were virtually third-class citizens. This is Philadelphia. You remember the story of Emmett Till, who was killed during the integration efforts. And the same thing happened to this woman's son, who was 12. He took his life in the same fashion. So that was just two boys I dearly loved, gone. It made me realize, it's tough to be on the bottom when everybody's stepping on you and nobody's lending you a hand. Now this was Esby. Taposhi Kitana, Shikbi, Oski Asomba, Homa, Lakana, Okchamali, Tishka Okakapasa, Shikbi, which is what she taught me to say. I'm making baskets out of some fishing cane. And she split the bark off, dye them different colors, put them in that little pot of water, and plowed them into baskets small enough for dangle earrings or big enough for a clothes hamper or to put potatoes in. And she didn't speak much English. She understood it, but because of the problem in Mississippi, she was so poorly treated. And her husband one day called their daughter, who had married a fellow in Indiana, and he said, I like working here. I can sit on one end of a log, white folks sit on the other end of the log, and we talk. They treat me like a human being. And so one of the last of the friends we had down there is Minko Bell. He was the leader of about 300 we now have at Gold Dust, Tennessee, a band of Choctaw. Their tribe has increased, and they have returned to some of their native haunts on the Mississippi. He's Shigby Oskia Sompa. He's made a blowgun dart out of Shotipanoli, out of cotton. And with that, he said that was the only rifle we ever had in the old days. We'd take squirrel and rabbits with it and birds, and they're pretty accurate. And of course, he's using the Choctaw shield there, and Shikalai Tana, the bead making, and we had pottery making, Shotigby, and we had a lot of other things. Now, one of the things the archaeologist and artist can do is to take the bones, put muscle tissue back on the bones and recreate the face of the chief who was buried at Okmulgee with these cockle shells and this monolithic axe and the mountain lion jaws. Impressive. It gives a human face in humility and dignity to this long dead person who must have been a great fellow. Anybody who could take 2 mountain lions. Davy Crockett said he could whip his weight in wildcats, but I think he was lying. Now, we're indebted to, over the years, a lot of people who have written up their life's work of trying to understand not just archaeology of the native Indians, but archaeology of the Bible and all of these. So one of the best places for this is at Old Stone Fort, at the museum there. The manager has built up a great book sales counter for you. And they also have a wonderful flint knapping. And the flint knapping is done every year, and people come from all over. One day we had the Indian Commission electing their officers over in a field. All the Indians were doing democracy. All the white guys were making arrowheads. And I thought, okay, that's good. We're learning from each other. So I have the good luck to be hired after I left Memphis and I went to Tulane briefly, and Tanya and I starved out and came back to Tennessee. They called and said, we need a naturalist in Nashville for the parks. So I came up. Next thing I knew, I wrote a speech for Governor Clement to dedicate Old Stone Fort. This was our second or third archaeological park. I think we got it in '66. We got Pinson Mounds either in '65 or '6, about the same time. He wanted to expand the parks. We wrote a budget for him, and for $5 million, the legislature allowed us to buy a dozen state parks, including Sergeant Dork's Little Mill, and Rock Island and Roan Mountain, and more of these wonderful sites like Stone Fort, Stone Door, which is now Savage Gulf, and Bone Cave. Those were all in that when the getting was good. By the way, that's Bill Paisley, who was a sanitation worker, and his wife from McMinnville. And Bill he was part Cherokee. This lady is Mrs. Grant. It was her son Harley who 20 years later got his PhD in nuclear engineering and was chairman of our Indian Commission. You saw him earlier. This is his mother. He was there that day. He was 15. So she was one of those who didn't go on the Trail of Tears, but sort of stayed in White County, where the wilderness up there of Scotts Gulf is still intact. You can't read because of the shadow, but that says Indian Division. I made that with a pair of scissors out of about 5 other logos that the Conservation Department had as their divisions, because we started the Division of Archaeology without a budget. I was literally borrowed from state parks with a state Jeep and my uniform and expense account for a while. The clerical error eliminated the money. So the governor gave us a little contingency grant, and the only thing in the budget was a little high-intensity light, those little bitty miniature bulbs that you're supposed to be able to look at something, a specimen. They thought we might want to look at some specimens. That was very thoughtful of them. On top of that car is a dent where I was in the middle of starting a new division. We also found we had to sue TVA to slow them down from the dam. I was hoping we'd stop them and transfer the land to the Cherokee Nation. But somebody tried to throw a cantaloupe-sized rock through my windshield, and I dodged them on the curve, and it only hit the top of the car. I found out starting up the archaeology business wasn't a piece of cake. Anyway, all the grim looks of these fellows here are because for the first and I think only time, the governor Dunn invited the legislature to go see what the money ought to be spent for and what it shouldn't be spent for. So we're on top of the Salts Mound, I believe, in Pinson, and they're all grim because I just asked them for $1 million for their archaeology budget. And my advisory council thought I was lost my mind, but I thought if we don't ask big, we'll never grow. And so we got $850,000. We bought half a dozen Native American sites. We hired 3 archaeologists and a staff, and in about 2 or 3 years we were off and going. Today, Pinson Mounds has the second highest mound in the U.S., 73 feet tall. We have a wonderful archaeological festival there, and Mark Norton, our archaeologist with the division, showing us some of the wonderful $1 million museum was built there because of the influence of the local people. And almost always in Tennessee, these parks did not happen because somebody on high wanted them. They happened because the local Rotary Club or the Chamber of Commerce or somebody wouldn't shut up, and they kept on, and that's how we got Pinson Mounds Park. I was in hopes we could have got that building up here closer to Nashville where we could have made our headquarters, but you get where the getting is good. Now this was our dream. We started Chucalissa in 55, Pinson in 65, Stonefort in 66, and we wanted to add Red Clay, the last capital of the Cherokee Nation, Tennessee, the namesake of our state, Bone Cave, the Sellers Mound, Bottom, Brick Church Mound, Dover Flint Quarries, Oban, and Rulfoot Mounds, but unfortunately we didn't get them all. But we got what we could get, and that article appeared in the Conservationist magazine to try to justify our existence. Here is Sellers Mound with Sandy, who was found there by one of the previous tenants, and the Representative Stratton Bone, who arranged to have this wonderful stamp issued right here at the site. And he also got the statue loaned from the University of Tennessee Museum. They turned me down. But they didn't him because he's a state legislator, and he slept there beside it with a shotgun and a cot. So it was guaranteed safe. This is the mother of the head of our BIA, and Sally Wells and Commissioner Fike. And this is the only other park site other than Rillfoot Lake that had to be condemned. They were about to make a subdivision and pan scrape it. And then they said we could have it, and we said no thank you. And the governor agreed to the condemnation. So that's how we got Sellers Mound. Now, in our Middle Tennessee area, we've been blessed with some incredible artifacts that the native peoples made. Look at the length of that wonderful Dover spear or celt. Look at the pottery. This was collected by General Thurston beginning during the Civil War. And by 1890, he published this wonderful book on antiquities of Tennessee. All of this stuff where he collected this is now under asphalt, including the Green Hills Shopping Center, which was a large site. Many of the sites moved away from the Cumberland River to large springs where they could be defended more readily. And Thurston, by the way, took Major Powell after he had his right arm amputated from Shiloh, and a mini-ball hit him. He was recovering here in Nashville, and he went out with Thurston and was so fascinated with the Native Americans here in our area that he went back to Washington and founded the Bureau of American Technology. He was already the director of the U.S. Geological Survey. So what an incredible link here. And these collections over the years that private people have made here in Tennessee are extremely valuable. And the most valuable thing is to keep them right here where they're found, and to keep people like Dr. Cushman, who's a brain surgeon, has had the resources to acquire and protect some of these incredible pieces. We're going to see more about him here at Link Farm, where he's talking with Professor Dye from the University of Memphis, John Brewster, a Middle Tennessee archaeologist, William and Mark from Task, and this is Kathleen Williams, the director of the Park and Greenway Foundation, and she worked out a rabbit foot that Dr. Cushman would sell us the rest of his farm. When we bought the Link Farm, which is the mounds behind here, we didn't buy all the land, we couldn't afford it, and he bought the rest of it and sat on it for 20 years until finally we got it, and the state paid her back. And so then he set up a revolving fund and gave $200,000 out of that to help not only save the Link site, which is where this Duck River cache came from. By the way, that spear is 27.5 inches long. And these were the crown jewels, you might say, that were plowed out by a farmer around 1890 and sold to the Missouri Historical Society until they decided they didn't need them anymore and offered them for sale to Tennessee. Nobody understood what they were, except one fellow named Charlie Peacock with the Tennessee Archaeological Society in Chattanooga, and he went to the governor, who knew you, and got the governor to buy it with his contingency fund for $12,000, though it's now at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And Dr. Cushman was given this recognition for his gift of $200,000 to help us to buy the rest of the Mound Bottom Farm, which for the first time gives us access to this incredible site. This is a very narrow isthmus of land. Most of these sites were built by the Native Americans for protection and as a sacred entranceway. And so here are 14 mounds and a large plaza, including a house, must have been a market house, 150 feet long, that Dr. Cuttriff surveyed when he did our preliminary archaeology work there. He was our middle citizen archaeologist. That's a huge mound. And then here's an older conical mound. And that view is from Mace Bluff. You'll see the Mace a little bit later on. Now what's missing at Mound Bottom are the Indians. We need to bring some Indian guides to work there. And so if you know some people that need work, let's beat the drum and get them on. This fellow was out at Fort Bledsoe for the dedication, and he looks like the kind of guy that the pioneers wouldn't want to meet on a dark wooded night. And that's exactly what we need to protect these sites. We need Native American guides. Now out at the Brentwood, this huge mound is what's left after the site has now been subdivided, and it was excavated partly by the Smithsonian. And in 1832, this little school or church was built. It's the oldest building in Williamson County. And because of subdivision regulations, they wouldn't let the guy bulldoze them. He had to donate 10 or 12 acres for a city park, so it's still there. But Mark tells me that this mound is now covered with bushes. It needs to be cleaned off, like the glass mound. So we'll get up some volunteers, maybe we'll get up some Boy Scouts as well, and go do that. Now we move to the Cherokee country. Because of all of the conflicts, the Cherokee people have suffered, I believe, among the worst. This is a view of Fort Loudon. It's not the original fort, because you see behind it the Tellico Reservoir that TVA flooded, and the Smoky Mountains in the distance. Cherokee, North Carolina is on the other side of the mountains, but this was where there were about a dozen Cherokee called the Overhill Towns, and this is where the action was at. In 1756, the British decided the French were making things a little too competitive, so they decided to build a fort out here to protect, they said, the Cherokee, and they brought the Cherokee some old outmoded Spanish ordnance that they'd confiscated off of Spanish boats. But a 300-pound cannon, even though it shot only a 3-inch ball, was very impressive, not just to the Cherokee, but to their enemies as well. And so I had to take one of those cannons back to get it treated for rust, and I know that's why I know how much it weighed. But this fort was raised by TVA. They spent about $1 million. Unfortunately, the dirt they used came from right here, which was the site of Tuskegee, where Sequoia's mother was probably buried. Now, we've all heard of Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And we understand more clearly now because of the incredible firepower that these long rifles had, a range of about a mile with deadly accuracy. And the reality is, with these arms, the Indians fell one by one, or they fell gradually to the technology. And that was one of the conflicts which, after a while, landing at Plymouth Rock, some of my Indian friends said the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, and it would have been better if the rock had landed on them, because they moved steadily westward, eliminating the competition. This picture is at Tennessee. It's a Native American site. For which our state is named. We had about a week from having it under option as a state archaeological park, and TVA issued condemnation. Somehow they found out what we were doing. If we had, we would have still had, I think, the river. But we had a crew working furiously to try to get what we could information before the river came up. We knew TVA had gone through, they lost almost every round. But finally, about 10:30 at night, a bill was slipped through that exempted Tellico from all laws, all federal laws, and that's how the second siege began. I got to take the chief of the Cherokee band over here to Mr. Crow, and he's looking at 12-foot deep strata of Native Americans' occupation on 30-acre hour, and that's how ancient. They found over 500 sites in the extra years they had to dig. which wasn't enough time. But some of those sites went back for a long time. I met Hawk Littlejohn, who was a medicine man from North Carolina. He was somewhat attracted to our division secretary, Susan Richardson, and I think it was also the other way around. And they're sitting in the Division of Archaeology. At that time, we had a conference room equal to the distance between those two pillars and over here to this wall. In that room, we had 6 desks and 5 telephones. And it was kind of wild. That's our motif, which I'll read you later on in passing. Bottom line is, Susan went on to be active with politics, finally got herself appointed with TVA and moderated the hearing in which TVA was selling off the shoreline. And 500 people said, stop it. And so she stopped it. And I'm always grateful for that. Hawk Littlejohn was very outspoken. In fact, he was quoted in the paper saying, I don't want to go out in a boat and take my son to show him the birthplace of Sequoia, and it'd be 40 feet below us and a half mile from shore. Well, that hit TVA upside the head. So after that, he was then accused by the FBI of being an Italian imposter. Not Cherokee at all. And he finally had to flee to Texas and hide out. Although he had been married by the former director of TVA, Arthur Morgan, who was, back in those days, had some clout. But Sequoia, as you know, was the most incredible story. This is the only time in history where one man succeeded in writing a syllabary that his people could learn to read in as short as 2 weeks. They didn't believe him at first, and his wife even burned his talking leaves, but he started over again. She said he was neglecting her. I'm sure he was, working on that. But Sequoia saw the value of this written language, although he did not speak English. He adapted some of the symbols. And so his people didn't believe him until his daughter read a letter from him when he was in Oklahoma. And he says, come on out here, lots of game, no pale face to bother us, good spot to be. And then they believed him. And so down here at Calhoun, Georgia, where the Indians had to remove to after ceding their Tennessee lands, there was the Cherokee Phoenix, their newspaper, which rose out of the ashes and rallied the people. They were more literate than anybody else in Georgia, and they were wealthier. And of course, when they struck gold down there in 1828, then Georgia said you can't be an Indian in Georgia anymore. And they began to seize their houses. And so we have Sequoia's best memorial right here. This is a national journalistic landmark for the whole country, if not the world. The TVA did one good thing that I appreciate. They decided to give a few acres to make a Sequoia museum and the money to do it right. And so they did. They not only have a nice museum, but they built a great sepulcher where they could rebury all the Cherokee remains that the archaeologists had found in a proper and holy way. And all of the clans are memorialized here in this wonderful mound. And so that's good. I don't know of another thing any nicer. Not so good for the farmers that live there. Some of their graveyards went under. Some of their farms went under. 32,000 acres were actually taken, mostly by condemnation. One judge never ruled against a TVA condemnation. And we sued for inadequate archaeology and got a 2-year stay of execution. Then they sued again under the snail darter. You remember the little fish that held up the dam, and that held for a while, so the TVA didn't impound until '79. This is the river, which was Tennessee's finest trout stream. The trout would grow an inch a month, about an ounce a month. It just was an amazing stream. 40-pound brown trout caught in this river. They were not native, but they were big fish. Anyway, it would have been a wonderful national wild river with Cherokee Indian guides going down it, but it was not to be. Now, this dugout canoe was washed out of the Tennessee River, many years ago, over a century ago, and it's now also at the UT Museum. Another thing that was accidentally found was the peace medal given to Chief Little Carpenter by King George II in 1732. And 4 Cherokee went to London When they saw how powerful the British were and what big ships and big guns they had, little Carpenter, whose name meant he was a diplomat, who could fit every log and notch perfectly together and make everybody agreeable. Attaculla was his Cherokee name. He said, we will not fight the British. And so that's why we're speaking English here tonight instead of French. And the other reason is Nancy Ward, who was a beloved woman. During the Battle of Horseshoe Bend with the Creeks, her husband was killed by the Creeks. She grabbed his gun and went on and led the charge, and they won the battle. And so her people were so grateful they made her a beloved woman. Her son, Five Killer, was also active in the same war. And so it's their grave is on the little Ocoee River, and it's a beautiful spot. But unfortunately, the relentless settlement of the pioneers pushed the Cherokee, and the irony is the Cherokee had just come down not long ago and pushed the Shawnee out. And so they had been driven south probably by the pressure of the first guns that were distributed to some of the northern Indians and put them at a disadvantage. And they had gotten down and occupied this vast area into South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and even up there in Kentucky. But each one of these represents a different treaty. And all the treaties were broken by guess who? The white man, who wanted more land. By 1761, after the fall of Fort Loudon, which happened in the year before, the Virginians killed 29 Cherokee, and the Cherokee laid siege to the British fort and killed 29 British in revenge, eye for an eye. But so the next year, Colonel Grant defeated their Cherokee, laid waste their fields, and having driven them to the mountains, compelled them to make peace. Francis Marion, on a letter, describes very feelingly the destruction of the growing crops and the villages of the Indians. Not many years later, of course, he was at the Battle of the Revolution. The mountain men marched down, and we were at war. Well, by about 100 years after Red Clay was abandoned by the Cherokee, the Daughters of American Revolution put up this memorial on the Georgia state line. It says, "The angels keep watch round the Indians' forest mound, and they have made it sacred ground," from Longfellow's Hiawatha. We were able to get the Red Clay Spring dedicated with Commissioner Tuck and Reverend and Mrs. Bushyhead from the Cherokee Nation of Prayer and Cherokee. And the reason we got it is this man bought the thing just ahead of a brewery. They were going to make beer. And Colonel Corn had the money, and he sat on it and held it until the state could take it over. He's being presented a flute from another archaeology member, Mr. Palmire. This was Howard Payne's flute, the man who wrote Home Sweet Home, who lived at Red Clay with a Cherokee and was arrested by the U.S. Army and imprisoned because he was regarded as complicit with the enemy, the Cherokee. He was held for a brief time. Now the park is open, and Geek Crow is showing people how to do the stomp dance. He's a little stooped because he has 2 wooden legs. He had diabetes, but he was a wood carver, so he carved his own prosthesis. A wonderful guy. His son is still doing dancing at Red Clay and was there this April when they had another 30-year reunion of the Eastern and Western Band. Now in 1984, they came back for the first time in 150 years and lit a sacred fire. What's interesting is that fire went in a wagon from Red Clay to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, where it continued to burn and is burning now. In 1932, 3 old men from Cherokee went out there in Model T Ford and brought the fire back in a charcoal bucket, relit the Cherokee fire, and this flame came from Cherokee and was marched over there by a team of young Cherokee athletes like Bullet Standing Deer. And this event is where it started at the Cherokee High School, and it wound up at the park. Now Cherokee, of course, for the last 40 years has had a wonderful pageant called Unto These Hills, which tells the story of the eviction of the Cherokee and the Sali, the Cherokee who, the soldiers came at night sometimes and rounded the Indians up. All they could get was a blanket and some pots and pans, and they had to march on the point of a bayonet to the Palisades. That particular night, the soldier was drunk. He prodded Mrs. Sali, the wife, And the husband was so enraged, he grabbed the gun, it went off and killed the soldier. And then they hunted him, couldn't find him. He fled to the Smokies. Finally, General Scott realized all the Indians were going to hide out. They wouldn't be able to complete his orders to evict him. So he said, if Solly will give himself up, I'll let the rest of you stay. And that's how, and he did. He was shot by his own brigade. And that's how come the Cherokee, North Carolina band is still there. Well, we had this historic reunion. There's the chief of Oklahoma band. He was appointed by President Kennedy, Ross Swimmer. His successor, however, was democratically elected, Wilma Mankiller.
It's her birthday today.
It's her birthday today.
She's 64.
Boy, and she's a heck of a woman.
Yeah,
You don't mess with a woman. And on the other end is standing the chief of the Eastern Band, and Robin Toynita with the council. And it was a really wonderful day when we were all there. People were united. We joined hands, white and red people were in solidarity. It was a great moment, and we hope to do it more often. On the far left is Jonathan Taylor with the big belly, and he was elected chief later on. If some of you may know Jonathan, he's like me, he liked to eat. Anyway, Jonathan thought, well, if you can't beat the paleface, you might as well beat up on them. So he got a casino started when he was chief. And I'll tell you what, a little money goes a long ways in a poor tribe like the Cherokee, and they have done a lot better since then. I remember the old days when they had, you almost had to stand out with a tin cup and get tips for posing with a bunch of souvenirs. But it's, some of you remember Iron-Eyed Cody. Some called him Onion-Eyed Cody. But he was a great hero to the young Indian people, and I think he did a wonderful job on the pollution campaign. I wish they'd bring him back. They've got the stuff in the can. It's sort of like the Tennessee trash guy. We need to bring him back by popular neglect, don't we? But anyway, I had to tell you this, but the people who hired him was the canning and bottling industry, who could make more money off of the container than they could the contents. So they want you to continue to buy it and throw it away, and then they'll go out and help you pick it up a little bit. So they treat the symptoms rather than the cause. So that difference in heritage there. Well, we do have the Trail of Tears now. It's a national trail running from Georgia and Tennessee all the way out to Oklahoma. We have a few original landmarks. That's one corner of Fort Marr, where the Cherokee were rounded up on the Georgia state line in 1838. We have some wonderful places like Brown's Tavern. As I said, the early Cherokee were wealthy. They had the original best places. They had the ferries, the taverns, and they charged appropriately. And they were, Zach Wamp claims to be part Native American. I suspect it's Cherokee. He had a big role in helping, that's Dwayne King from the Western Band, the chief of the Creek Nation at that time, and setting aside Moccasin Bend here as a part of the Chickamauga-Chattanooga battlefield, which was our oldest battlefield, by the way, in 1890. And we were able to buy Williams Island, which was the Creek town, not Cherokee. When the Spanish expedition came through in 1521, Pardo got grain from them, and probably DeSoto. But I bet Moccasin Bend's the only national park with a city sewage plant in it. Unfortunately, we inherited some problems. This is what the original towns were like. When the Indians, Cherokee got run out of the Little T, they came down to Chattanooga and made the same names, the same towns all over again. And they lived here for a while until more paleface showed up, and finally a band from Nashville came down and shot out what they called the Chickamauga Band and broke up. Some of them likely were taking refuge in Nickajack Cave, probably one of the greatest caves on the biggest river that was never excavated. TVA was not going to be embarrassed by finding anything, so when they did find a spear, they threw it in the river because they didn't want to get, they couldn't be sure where it really came from. It was surface fine, they said. But that cave is now flooded within about 4 feet, 5 feet at the top, and the bats just love it. So there's something good in everything. They have their own private little place. As long as they don't get this white-nosed fungus, they'll make it okay. But I would say over the years, Tennessee's lost more archaeology than we'll ever recover. It's sad. We were able to get, again, the Park and Greenway Foundation, whittle the owner out of the first million, raised the second million, and got a government grant for the third. And that's how we got this incredible cathedral in the earth. Now, native peoples can't build a great Chartres cathedral like they can in France. They don't have the tax base that the church had at that time. And so they found these caves to have the acoustics where they could go back in the insides and have their sacred songs and their medicine and their chanting, and the sound is unbelievable. And it's the same way at Lascaux, France. They just began to figure out what was really going on. And back in the chamber, inner chamber, you have a whole panoply of a monolithic axe, another one here with the tip on the end, an eagle priest with a weeping eye design and a scepter, a flared eagle tail, and the head of a sacrificial victim, I suspect, with his last gasp. There's the lips and the eye, and it goes on around. There's over 30 different pictoglyphs here. This is one of the richest caves in the country, according to Dr. Simic, the head of UT, who's an expert. Now we own it, and we've got a gate to keep the Kilroys at bay from defacing this wonderful work. Here's another petroglyph out here on the Harpeth, and what's interesting, this war club with the stone, almost invariably when it's carved, has a little triangular tip at the end, which I suspect means the head pyramid, the head mound. And you see the same thing here at the gorget found at the Castilian Spring site, which we now own as a state archaeological park up near Gallatin. Here's the head of a sacrificial victim, and the chief priest, who's obviously left-handed here. Now we haven't found any heads, and I'm sorry I forgot to turn my phone off. Maybe it'll go away in a bit. The origin of this mythology comes out of Mexico, where they had a great thing for Quetzalcoatl. And this incredible page out of one of the codices tells you what an incredible amount of learning we missed. One priest named Zumarraga burned the last 400 books of the Mayans, and it took us several hundred years to finally decipher. Finally, there was a Russian named Proshurikov who figured out some of the missing links, and now they can actually read what all these glyphs mean. They're usually the record of the king and the history of the people that are written into stone in many cases where we have burned what was written on paper. This is the Palace of Governors in Mexico City. Diego Rivera shows you how rich and incredible the pyramids were. They weren't just made out of stone. They were brightly painted, and they were awesome. This is Chichen Itza, which was not only an old Maya town, but later taken over by the Toltecs or Aztecs. And this is a jaguar made into an altar, sacrificial altar. And there are rattlesnakes at the bottom, so that when the solstice comes, the rising sun lights them up. It's really amazing. And then there's Teotihuacan, which has the largest pyramid in volume in the world. And at that time, it was bigger than Rome or Athens. So the Native American people were a primary people that were on their way to great things. Sadly, they cut too many trees down for their buildings, and they got caught in the same drought, which probably wiped out the Anasazi at Mesa Verde. And so these towns had to be abandoned. The last of these was that the Spanish didn't find for years, was Tulum by the sea. What an incredible place. And that's the observatory, that little window. When the solstice comes up, it's so perfectly aligned. This is what happens on the solstice. You get this starburst of the sun coming through. Mound Bottom is aligned in the same way. And of course the highest pyramids, I guess, are at Tikal, where they still have a copal incense burning ceremony of Mayan people. You have more native people, I believe, in Guatemala and Bolivia and Mexico than almost anywhere else. As far as south, though, as Iguazu Falls in Argentina, I've noticed the native peoples out on the walkway selling their wonderful crafts. And as long as that can continue, there's a bridge of art and artifacts that everyone understands. And that is one of the great interfaces. We got, as a naturalist on the Amazon, a wonderful native person who had taught himself 6 languages. He jumped out of the boat and grabbed this little gator before he could duck. And he was like the John Muir of the Amazon. I never met anybody quite so brilliant. I wish there was some way I could have taped him and listened to him by the hour. Then there was Payakan, who came from the Kayapo tribe. That's a group that's gradually been whittled on by the miners and the loggers in Brazil. He stopped at the World Trade Conference in Miami and told the truth on what was happening in India to the Indians down there. And Brazil wouldn't let him back in the country. He had to get him a lawyer. He had to raise money. He brought some souvenirs. We auctioned this one off to the Sierra Club. I gave him my last $50 bill for Mad Money, and he made it back, and is still at it. And they bought a video camera. So now when the government agent comes and makes these promises, they got him on videotape. It's hard to go back on him, a lot harder. This is one of the last of 300 Carib Indians left in Dominica. This was the most populous tribe in the Caribbean. Now, the colonial days were usually started by the Queen Victoria and wound up ending with the cannons. And the conflicts were, and still are, continuing to be pretty brutal. This was the result of Ollie North and the making the world safe for democracy. They eliminated all these poor communists, about 250,000 Mayans. And of course, you don't look like communists to me. They're just communal people trying to grow enough corn to get along. The Chipka movement in India, these are the real Indians, but they got tired of their corrupt politicians selling off their woods to these multinational corporations, so the women chained themselves to the trees. Some of them were killed by the chainsaws, but finally they quit logging their forest. The Chipka movement and other native groups like this have succeeded. Otherwise, this is what happens when you cut all the trees down. This is the Satoish, the Badlands, in so much of Brazil. This was the size logs that were down there in 1970 when I first went back into the Amazonic Valley, and now they're mostly gone. And that bare land is what you see. So we have allies, and we need to. The guards, they got past the guards somehow and dropped that banner for a few minutes. The Seminole people, few people realize President Jackson not only went after the Cherokee, but he spent $22 million trying to extirpate the Seminole. He never did. They just kept retreating into the woods. And the Seminole, you know, were a mixture of Creek, of other native tribes, maybe Choctaw. They also liberated a lot of slaves. They burned the sugar plantations and eliminated their slaves. That's why Jackson wanted to make an example out of them, but didn't work. But living in the jungles, they learned a lot about medicines. And this is just some of the medicines that I photographed at a market at Manaus in Brazil. Not a very good picture. It was a hard place to shoot pictures of. But the herbal medicine that the native peoples practice is a lore, which is very, very important. When I took Chief Powell to the Little Tennessee Valley in 1972, he wasn't interested in the Indian graves. He was interested in the medicine. He said, my people came from a rich place. And he was pointing at pawpaw, which in the last 5 years has been found to be a chemotherapy for a type of uterine cancer. So the Indians knew a lot of things which we should not have eliminated by killing off their wise medicine men. Kanshi Palashka, this Choctaw lady, is making cornbread. The food they gave us was the gold. And this little Maya stand where they charcoal grill corn is just delicious. And this is the way people do. The most wonderful farmers I've ever met were native Indian people. This is on the hillside in Guatemala, but it could be at Machu Picchu, which I suspect is a high altitude grow out for the potatoes. They have over 3,000 varieties down there. And the only problem is I saw too much DDT still being sprayed, and that's the sad part. The answer is organic, but you have to pay a little more, you have to work at it. But when Tanya and I went out to the Navajo Fair at Four Corners, we were amazed to see the diversity they could grow in these Hopi-type raised beds. in such a dry environment. We stopped here, but they said they didn't have much water. The nearest well was 15 miles away. This is in the largest reservation, the Navajo Reservation, where I think they have the largest number of people, but it's not good land. It's what was left over. We call it Window Rock, which is their capital. And of course, Mesa Verde finally suffered from that long drought. That was our first archaeological park set aside by President Roosevelt. You imagine the idiots that use these sacred petroglyphs for targets, but that's the conflict of heritage. Honoré de Balzac said, human nature tends to destroy what it does not understand, and we continue to do that. We almost shut out the buffalo. We got down to probably less than 50 of an animal that was in the millions. An animal that could run 30 miles an hour for a week if they want to, has about 3 to 5% cholesterol, and is now on Ted Turner's ranch and being served over here on West End as buffalo burgers, and it's just delicious. The Indians all know that.
But you know that was started by de Montbriand right here.
Right. Yeah, de Montbriand came and made friends. The Frenchmen traded with the Indians. When Isaac Bledsoe came across on the Cumberland and saw the Indian with a rifle, he shot him and stole his rifle. He had just got it from de Montbriand. He traded for it. He traded skins for it, you know. And that's a difference in perception of cultures. Anyway, the buffalo are back, and they're here to stay. Now, native peoples have to eat what they can get. Up in the north, the Aleuts take what Sarah Palin says. They're really butchering Alaska pretty fast. I met an Indian who took me in his boat 50 miles up the Stickeen River. He said Canadians are hauling 500 truckloads a day out of here on the Canadian side. No salmon, no trees, no salmon, no bears, no eagles, no Indians. Why? Well, that was a question that rang in my ears and still does. Why? In '72, when I was state archaeologist, I decided I better know what I was doing. I took a month's holiday and went to Europe, went to Greece, went to Italy, studied the great archaeological sites, and came back with a pocket full of ideas. I hitchhiked to the Environmental Forum at Stockholm. I couldn't get Howard Baker to give me a pass, so I went to the People's Forum, which was wonderful, because I met Thomas Binyaka. He was telling the Hopi leader, he was telling what was happening to his people, the uranium mining, and ruining the land and ruining the lungs of his people. And boy, the world's media picked up on that at the environmental conference. I found out years later I couldn't get a permit because I was on the shit list, if I may be so blunt. TVA, everybody who opposed their dam wound up on the wrong side of the register. And Internal Revenue Service was watching you, the FBI was watching you, they'd probably take you tonight as well. But anyway, that's the way it goes. That's an art. I'm glad to have my own videography team. Now, Binyaka says certain places in the natural world, mountains and rivers, forests, canyons, lava craters, and areas where spiritual events occurred or medicines grow are among the sites that are sacred to Native peoples. And I moderated a panel with him later. I went to an indigenous environmental forum. That guy's from Peru, this one's from Guatemala, this one is from Costa Rica. They were hosting all of these Native peoples, and they were coming out, as this cartoon shows, Cahokia, the largest mound in East St. Louis, 1,000 years ago, but 2,000 now, covered up with pollution. From the Stauffer Company and the Monsanto plant that made mothballs not far away. Back to start the National Wildlife Federation, Ding Darling drew this cartoon who claimed that civilization has scalped so much of the continent that the moon says it's just as well not inhabited. Of course, we're trying to fix that. But one of the saddest things is what we've done along the Rio Grande. We've made a wasteland of what precious little water that river has, and the poor native peoples who live there have no choice but to use the water that comes down the river, while the industrial development on the cheap side of Mexico continues to take jobs from up here. Something wrong there. So you would think that's the only Indian we cared for, but with Liberty, it was slow in coming, and still is. Sitting Bull said it best. He said, "Hear me, people, we have now to deal with another race, at first small and feeble when our fathers first met them, but now grown great and overbearing. They have a mind to till the soul. Their love of possessions is a disease with them. They litter this Mother Earth of ours with their refuse. They fence their neighbors away. That nation will become like a spring freshet which overflows its banks and destroys everything in its path." The sad thing is that Buffalo Bill took Sitting Bull with him on the European tours, in London and Berlin. The Europeans love the Indians, and that's why our Indian will excel more over there than anywhere else. Sadly, when he came home, he got shot in his home jail by the guards. They said he was trying to escape. But that's history. One of the most remarkable stories, and I'm closing down with this, because Sacagawea was the woman who married a French trader as a young lady. She was caught. She was out picking berries, and she was caught by a neighboring tribe, sold, and this Frenchman bought her for a wife. And so when he hired on as a guide, he spoke some of the language. She spoke Shoshone. When they got the Lewis and Clark expedition, got out to the most critical point where they desperately needed help from the Indians, it was her brother who was the chief. What a coincidence. And so that's how that expedition was able to go and come back in those years without any loss of life other than one appendicitis. What a remarkable woman. Not only that, but when the canoe capsized, she fished Lewis's notes out of the water and saved that for the journal, which is now still available. In the 200th anniversary of that expedition, we had a Lewis and Clark Day out at Long Hunter, and you can see the fascination that kids have with all things Native American. And that's why the Mount Juliet powwow has been so successful. There's Sally Wells, a little younger. There's Marjorie John. When she was 16, I thought about marrying her, but I didn't want to dilute her pure Choctaw bloodline, so she married another white guy and said, "It's beautiful children." But anyway, she came up to Nashville barefoot one day. She saw two guys down there at the Jefferson Street dig where they shouldn't have been, where the sign says "keep out." She ran them down and got them prosecuted. She's a heck of a woman. There's J.J. Kent, who got on the choo-choo train to Lebanon and is showing people about Native stuff. He does a wonderful job. And there's Albert Bender, co-leading this wonderful Walmart. It wasn't wonderful, it was horrible, wasn't it, Al Bender? We had hopes of stopping it, but of course with the councilman's action, it wasn't stoppable. They had to move 170 graves that we know of. Very expensive, very brutal. I hope Walmart can learn there are some places be better off not filled, but we lost this one. And this is, of course, what many of them were buried in these stone coffins. But this is what we're up against, my friends. That's why this little group, this is a small band, a small tribe we have here. May our tribe increase, because what you have already accomplished helps. The forestry division grew trees at Pinson. That's my old 58 truck when I first started. And they had a privy up on the mound. After all the letters and complaints, Mark, thank you, that this group made, they moved that stuff. And we've got some land swaps down there, so it's still, it's better off than it was. We co-sponsored a Sacred Sites run with Ben Yahola from up in Wisconsin. That's the Creek Chief's daughter and grandchild. So we were glad to be a co-rally person and a co-signer on the glass mounds out here at Franklin. We hope someday to get a crew and Boy Scouts and clean that off. And Mark's working on a protocol where an easement can be signed by the owners and the Division of Archaeology and by the Park and Greenway Foundation, and this will be forever, that these little sites can be saved. Mark and I went up to meet with Roy Capps up here at Solana. He found this incredible stone statuette, and it's in the bank vault. We have hopes of making an archaeological park there. And so never forget the good that you're doing. It will outlast you, and keep it up. We brought in Joe Watkins, the Choctaw archaeologist, and we still have hopes of getting someday the other half of the mound bottom. This was originally 300 acres in this great site, which is upstream from the one we own. The owners, one side wants to sell, the other side doesn't, so we hope to work it out. But so far, pertinacity is what pays. Now, every archaeologist knows in our heart why we dig, in pity and humility, that the dead may live again, that somehow something may be salvaged from the rack of the ages, and thus allow us to repay the debt that we owe those who have fashioned the world that we inherit. And so these are sacred places that I've shown you tonight, and there will be more of these, we hope, in the days to come, but we must hurry because the dozers are out there. And we had a sunrise solstice ceremony at Mound Bottom years ago when the Maya calendar year expired. What did they call it? Can't think of it. Yeah, harmonic convergence. Thank you. One of my Indian friends says, "Oh, Mac, your picture won't take. Too much going on, too much energy here." The whole roll was fogged, not just that picture. The whole roll was red. But at least I got a little bit of an image. So I'll close with this image of Pinson, that these are sacred places that we are now in custody of. They don't belong to us, they belong to the ages. And the pilgrims are coming to visit these shrines of ancient origin, which have meanings to all of us in the days to come. Thank you. I have spoken.